After JSON files, the second most common way to provide configuration for .NET and ASP.NET Core applications is via environment variables. In this demo, we'll learn how to define environment variables, which will be loaded by the environment variable configuration provider. We'll also learn about a more straightforward way to provide environment variables during development by using launchSettings.json. Because the environment variables configuration provider is added by default in ASP.NET Core applications, little work is needed from us to begin using them. We'll run the applications via PowerShell consoles to see environment variables take effect. I have 3 tabs open in the Windows terminal. The first 2 have been used to start the Weather API and the Branded Products API using the .NET Run command. If these fail to start due to port binding issues, you may need to close all of the Visual Studio console windows before these will execute properly on your environment. The final tab is in the root directory for the tennis booking project. We can use the .NET Run command to start executing the tennis booking application. It takes a few moments for the application to build and run, and once started, we begin to see logs from the application appear in the console. We can copy the HTTPS URL from the console and paste it into the browser to view the home page. Currently, this page uses blue text for the greeting. If I stop the application by pressing Ctrl+C, I can set an environment variable to configure the color using a suitable PowerShell command. There are several ways to achieve this in PowerShell. I'll use the .NET System.Environment class to set an environment variable here. As its first argument, it requires the name of the variable. The configuration entry for the greeting color is defined within a hierarchy of sections. With environment variables, the colon separator does not work on all platforms. Therefore, the safest separator to use is a double underscore. The environment variable provider knows how to interpret underscores as a separator and handles them correctly. I'll set a variable called features _greeting _greeting color. And as the second argument, I'll provide a value which specifies the hex code for red. I'll target this as a user-scoped environment variable. Normally, I'd need to reload the PowerShell process for this new variable to be picked up and be available. I can avoid that by pasting in a command to set a variable for this session by copying the value from the user-scoped variable we just defined. With this complete, if I rerun the application and refresh the page, the greeting text is now red. How you set environment variables depends on your operating system and your choice of terminal. I'll demonstrate a convenient way to configure environment variables during development using Visual Studio. Before we switch back to Visual Studio, we need to stop the tennis booking application and each of the APIs by pressing Ctrl+C within each tab. For Visual Studio to pick up our new environment variable, I'm going to first need to reload it. Once loaded, let's debug the application to check that the variable has been picked up. Great, the greeting text is red. When using Visual Studio, we can use the launchSettings.json file to define environment variables. You'll see that by default, the launch settings file uses this approach to set the ASP.NET Core _environment variable to development. By default, when ASP.NET Core hosting begins, it will assume that it's running in a production environment, unless this has been configured using this specific environment variable. We can define our own environment variables here too. I'll add one to set the greeting color to a cyan blue. We can specify the name for the environment variable using underscores for the separators, and then provide our hex value for the color that we want to use. If I run the application from Visual Studio by pressing F5 to begin debugging, indeed the color for the greeting text is now cyan. As a reminder, the environment variables take precedence over configuration entries from the app settings JSON files, because the environment variable configuration source is added after the JSON configuration sources. With the rise of containerization, environment variables are a cross-platform and container-compatible way to provide runtime configuration. Before we move on, let's remove this environment variable entry from the launch settings JSON file and save it. Another way to configure a .NET application is via command line arguments. In this demo, we'll start and configure the tennis booking application from the command line using the .NET CLI. We'll return to Windows Terminal for this demo. I've stopped debugging my application in Visual Studio and must restart my API services once again. I can use .NET Run to start each of the APIs, and then in this final tab, I'll use .NET Run to start the tennis booking project. When the application is ready and I navigate to the home page, the greeting is currently red, as specified by the environment variable we configured in the previous clip. I'll stop the web application so that we can see how to start it and pass in some configuration. I'll use the .NET Run command again, but I can include an extra argument. Arguments must be provided in a specific format for them to take effect within configuration. After 2 dashes, I provide the full hierarchical key name for the greeting color configuration. For command line arguments, the colon character can be used to delimit the different sections. After providing the key, I can leave a space and then provide the value. In this case, the hex code for a kind of pinkish color. Pressing enter will start my application, and the command line configuration provider will parse the arguments. It will load the value for the greeting color, which will now take effect in the running application. If I refresh the page, we can see the greeting color is now pink. The default host builder includes the command line provider, so I don't need to do anything special to support this. The configuration value from the command line argument takes precedence over any values set via the environment variables because by default the command line provider is the last to be executed. .NET supports 2 other styles of formatting to provide configuration values via the command line. We can skip the double dash before the key and use an equal character before providing the value. We can also prefix the key with a slash and then include the value after the equal character. It's not always necessary to enclose the value in quotes in this form. It's recommended not to mix and match styles when providing command line arguments. I prefer the double dash syntax. In my experience, I've rarely configured applications via the command line, but it's easy enough to apply when you need to. As a final step before we move on, let's clean up our environment variable. I'll paste in a command to set the environment variable to null, which clears it from the user-scoped variables. We won't be using the command line for any further demos, so I'm going to ensure I stop the tennis booking application and each of the API services by pressing Ctrl+C in each PowerShell tab. Configuration can be used to store all sorts of settings for your application. As we've seen in the demos thus far, much of this will relate to how an application functions and which features are available. Configuration entries are generally not sensitive, so having them checked in as JSON configuration files is perfectly fine. Each developer working on the application can pull down those configuration files and get the same configuration when they launch the code in development. You will likely have some cases where you need to store sensitive settings, perhaps passwords for a database or API keys for external services. These values, if leaked, could provide an attack vector and lead to misuse of your own or third-party services. As developers, we have considerable responsibility for security and must ensure we endeavour to follow best practices when dealing with sensitive data and secrets. It's therefore crucial to consider the sensitivity of all configuration values to the security of your application and your overall environment. For simplicity, it may be very tempting to include these sensitive settings in the app-settings.json files. This is really dangerous since the plain text app-settings.json file will be checked into your source control and the history containing these values will likely live forever. As part of code reviews, teams should be working together to ensure the security of secrets and prevent them from being included in plain text configuration. However, by then, it may be too late. Mistakes are easy to make. I'll be honest, I once checked in a personal API key for a third-party email service into an open-source GitHub repository without realizing it. Once my mistake was highlighted, I had to revoke the API key, and fortunately, no harm was done. Revoking production API keys would likely be a much bigger deal. The best security for sensitive data is designing systems so that no human can access the data, only the services and the machines that need it. In the following few clips, we'll look at techniques for development time and production time safety of secrets, which can feed into the application configuration.